Well, normally, of course, you thank the organizers for inviting you, but since I'm part of the organizers, I won't thank myself. And anyway, for anyone in medicine, which is my original background, if you're asked to talk about the history of your subject, it is because you're either retired or very close to retirement. As some of you may know, a favorite hobby of retired medical doctors is to pretend that they're historians. Now, I'm not a historian of any description. So what I say is my personal take on the history of bioethics, and especially the role that theory has played. Now, first of all, of course, the history of bioethics is slightly contentious, and I think one of the problems in talking about the history of bioethics is essentially that it hasn't always had the shape that it has now. And it isn't the case that everything that's sort of ever come into bioethics is still there. There are things that were part of bioethics at a certain point in time which are no longer part of bioethics or play a very small role, and I'll mention at least one example of that. And when we look at the history, we might tend to forget those things because they're no longer part of what we would call the mainstream. Finally, secondly, theory has many different meanings. When I speak about theory here, it is moral theory as understood within moral philosophy or moral theology. Because of my own limitations, this focuses on Northern Europe and Anglo-American bioethics, and when I'm talking about bioethics, I'm using it with its American connotations. So essentially, medical ethics and closely adjoining areas, not the use which is much more common in Europe, and especially in continental Europe, where it takes in environmental ethics, animal ethics, and many other things. And I'm primarily discussing academic bioethics. Now, where did the field come from? Well, I think it came from many places. This is one of the contested areas, and at least geographically, you will find that bioethics came from the US, the UK, and whatever country the author of the chapter on the history of bioethics happens to come from. And that's, of course, because in traditional medical ethics in the 1960s and the 1950s, for almost every industrialized country, you will find someone who has written a book about euthanasia. You will find someone who has written something about research ethics. Is that part of the history of bioethics, or isn't it part of the history of bioethics? But my take on it is that bioethics come from three places. It comes from traditional medical ethics, it comes from Catholic and Protestant moral theology, and it comes from applied moral philosophy. And within both moral theology and moral philosophy, there was, or developed in the 1960s, an increased interest in what we could contentiously call real-world problems, including the problems of medicine. And an important part of the development of Catholic moral theology was that there was, among liberal Catholics and liberal Catholic moral theologians, a lot of disappointment with the eventual outcome of Vatican II, which led a lot of people to break with Catholic orthodoxy in various ways. And this, of course, is one of the things that it's not written out of the history of bioethics, but it's written out of the history of bioethics that most bioethicists have in their mind. That if you look at the beginnings of bioethics in many countries, you will see that there are quite a lot of theologians around, of very many different kinds. Now, not all of those I've mentioned here are theologians. Daniel Callahan is not a theologian, but he was a very prominent Catholic layperson before he founded the Hastings Center. So one of the things that has happened is that the theological part of bioethics, which was very prominent at one point, has to a large extent disappeared. And there are a number of people in the field today, of course, which have background in theology, but who don't advertise this as their entry to bioethics. What kind of theory was prominent in sort of early bioethics? I think that's, again, a difficult question because it depends on how exactly you define the field we are talking about. But if you look at the philosophical part, it's obvious that what we could broadly call Oxford utilitarianism, traceable to Richard Hare and later Jonathan Glover, played and still plays a significant role in bioethics. In the US, pragmatist moral philosophy and a particular kind of right theory inspired by Rawls also played a large role at the beginning of bioethics. And of course, there were also large roles, as I've already alluded to, played by liberal Catholic moral theology and liberal Protestant moral theology. I think, for instance, the first real personhood theory in our modern understanding of it and applied to bioethical issues was put forward by Joseph Fletcher long before any of our Oxford-inspired philosophers came upon the idea. And of course, he was a Protestant moral theologian of a not very orthodox kind. So I think if we look at the early years of bioethics, we will find that various forms of theory plays a large role. If we look at bioethics today, I think theory plays a much smaller role. Now, why is that? Well, one reason is, of course, that for a significant time, very little happened in Oxford utilitarianism which was of any interest to anyone. It had a particular form, and people reasoned within that form, and it's only very recently that sort of this theoretical stasis has been superseded by new developments. In American pragmatism, there was a postmodern turn which made it almost unsuitable for bioethical thinking. And then I think something else also happened, and this, I think, connects to something that Jørgen Hammerén mentioned yesterday about the difference between theoretical and practical ethics. Because bioethicists found that they could do bioethics in a strange kind of middle register. You didn't need theory for the practical work. And as Jørgen already mentioned yesterday, theory might even get in the way of the practical work, in the sense that if you nail your flag to any particular theoretical mast, your audience for your conclusions becomes smaller. So bioethicists developed various ways of doing practical bioethics, which were, at least on the face of it, not theory reliant. And I think the standard way is, which you'll see in lots of writings in bioethics, including many of my own papers, is to proceed essentially by way of analogy. To proceed by presenting, taking the question at hand, finding something you think are persuasive analogies, and trying to persuade other people that they should see it that way, without committing yourself to any particular kind of underlying theory. Now, I've already said something about why it happened, but I think it happened for a whole range of reasons. First of all, of course, the reason that we, to a large extent, lost moral theology from the debate is that there has been a very pronounced split between secular and religious bioethics. It's not the case that religious bioethics doesn't exist. It's just the case that the two different kinds of bioethics don't interact very much anymore. Then, as I've already mentioned, there's this need to communicate bioethics to practitioners and decision makers, which is easier if you don't tell them, well, my conclusions follow from prescriptivist preference utilitarianism. First of all, they won't understand what you say, and secondly, of course, by not doing this, by not being explicit about the underlying theory, you, at least on the face of it, do not commit yourself to all the consequences of that theory. And as anyone here who is a moral philosopher will know, if you really commit yourself to an ethical theory, you commit yourself to a whole range of hugely counterintuitive results. There is no moral theory which accords in any way with what we take as, what most people would take as reasonable intuitions about practical issues. So if you commit, people who know something about it will be able to say to you, so you say you're a preference utilitarian, does that mean that you think that infanticide up to the age of personhood is all right? Or you think you're a libertarian, and do you agree with Engelhardt that it's all right to sell your children before they become persons? So there are lots of reasons, pragmatic reasons for not committing. And then I think we have a split between moral philosophy and bioethics, which is partly institutional, partly in the way it's done. And on the side of bioethics, this split, I think, is driven by a development of, if you are kind, you call them stock arguments. If you are unkind, you would call them bioethical platitudes. A set of ready-made arguments that bioethicists can apply to almost any practical issue that comes before them. Also, that if theory occurs in bioethical writings, and of course there are frequent references to Kant and Mill, they're not really references to Kant and Mill, they're references to a very, very tiny fragment of what Mill has ever said.